You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Alexandra Monir.
Writers, I have an amazing tool to tell you about. A revolutionary writing tool for planning stories. Campfire Pro is what novelists need to go from the seed of an idea to a detailed plan that's ready to be executed. Complete your character design, create a timeline, and track your world building all in one place with our downloadable desktop app for Mac and PC. Without the annoying subscription model so many apps are using today. Visit campfiretechnology.com for special holiday pricing on Campfire Pro today. Who Wants to Love a Billionaire? Billionaires in New York, Book 1 by Laura Burton. Do you have a favorite writer whose books are auto-buys for you? Wouldn't you love for readers to have you on their auto-buy list, then recommend your books to their friends and on social media? The good news is there are subtle things you can do, things that are nearly invisible to the reader, that will make your stories unputdownable. The Beyond 10 Days course from Victory Editing can help you get the most from your stories and help you build that relationship with readers through your writing. This course is full of awesome, and best of all, you don't have to fly across the country or put on pants. In this course, we'll focus on avoiding info dumps, dialogue mechanics, show versus tell in dialogue, carrying show versus tell forward to your narrative, deepening your point of view and strengthening your protagonist's voice, overwriting and how to avoid it. 10 hours of video content with text and audio downloads. Shine that diamond. Join me at the Beyond 10 Days course. Go to hankgarner.com and click the banner to sign up today. Authors, I have a fantastic new service to tell you about. It's called PubSite. PubSite is a service to help you build your very own website, your home on the web, where you can promote your work and give your fans a place to connect with you. PubSite is a website platform that allows every author, regardless of budget, to have a great-looking professional website. Developed by the book marketing professionals at FSB Associates, PubSite is the new, easy-to-use DIY website builder developed specifically for books and authors. Whether you're an author of one book or 20, or a small publisher, PubSite allows you to build, design, and most importantly, update your website pain-free. No need to be dependent on a designer or webmaster to make a small but costly change to your website. Save the money and do it yourself. PubSite is the best platform for authors because it's a book-centric platform. PubSite was built just for authors and small publishers. Every design, feature, and layout is book-centric. They have customized designs for you to use. It's easy to build. No coding or HTML is necessary to create a stunning, professional-looking website with all the features you want. Get a custom domain name, yourname.com. It's simple to update. You can add all of your books, add a blog and a book tour, sell from any retailer, manage your email list and social media, and even do e-commerce. Build your website with a 14-day free trial, then pay just $19.99 per month, which includes hosting. And we offer packages starting at $499 to set up the website for you. Pub-site.com, the place to help authors find their home on the web. The Feisty Heroine romance collection of short stories. Over 30 plus pulse racing shorts to capture your heart with USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and award-winning authors in the mix. Paranormal, contemporary, fantasy, and historical romance that will whet your appetite with titillating, heart-pounding tales you'll want to read again, then beg for more. Fall in love with your next book crush. Pre-order this amazing collection of shorts, over 30 pulse-pounding stories for only 99 cents.
proceed with caution. Buying this collection may lead to addictive reading, falling in love with your next book crush, and staying up past your bedtime to see what happens next.
Get your limited edition copy of Feisty Heroines. Look for the link in the show notes of this episode. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Alexandra Monir on the show with me today. She has a fantastic new book. It just came out yesterday. It's called The Life Below, and this is the second book in the Final Six series. What a great series. I love it. I love what you're doing here. Alexandra, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind words and for having me on the show. I'm really excited.
I'm excited to have you. Alexandra, we begin each show with the same question.
Yeah.
And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Ooh, that's a good one. You know, I've been writing stories for so long, since I was 7. And I do have this image of, I think when I really fell in love with writing, it was a family trip to Europe. And I was 7 years old, and I had this little notebook, this journal, and I would just while we were on trains and sightseeing and everything, I was just constantly writing. And if you look back on it, it's hilarious because I was basically writing how things sounded rather than they were spelled. So it reads kind of like gibberish. But I think there was something about just being in a new place that felt very, inspiring and different from what I was used to, coming from a suburban Northern California upbringing. And suddenly I was in this amazing old world Italy. That brought out a lot of this. I was too young to really understand it, but this desire to kind of express myself and create. And I was just inspired. And I read Little Women around that time too, which I realize now it's pretty young to read that book, but I think I definitely identified with Jo March. And so the idea of being an author was so just dreamy and exciting to me.
I love it. Aside from Little Women, I know that you're a pretty big fan of science fiction and fantasy type stories. Do you remember what the first series, or maybe it was an author or maybe a particular book that really opened your imagination to those kinds of stories?
Yeah. So there was this British author, Edward Eager, and he had this great series for kids. It started with Half Magic, and then there was one that I was obsessed with called The Time Garden, which, was a time travel one, and that kind of kickstarted my early love and fascination with the idea of time travel. And so those books were great. They're so magical. It's kind of like the Harry Potter audience, but a little younger. I would say they're middle grade books. But even now, I'm sure if you as an adult reader pick them up, they're just so enchanting and fun. And I would say those were the first books where I really got excited about the idea of, fantasy and sci-fi elements.
Your books tend to be kind of YA for that audience, and with that sort of aesthetic, if you want to think of it that way. There's something magical that happens with a YA or a middle grade book that, when done well, resonates with a hugely broad audience. I mean, look at Harry Potter, look at, we still read Narnia and those types of stories, and we read them seriously, not as kids' stories.
Totally.
And your stories are like that. I felt a real connection with your characters and with the story.
Yay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. When writing and thinking about that audience, or do you, what is it about the storytelling, do you think that goes from, that helps you bridge that gap between, I'm looking for a word here. We've all read books that were entertaining, and then we put them in a box and gave them away to someone else who never read it again. Or, when you step over into something else, to a book that means something to you, and you go back to it over and over again. Do you see a difference there, and what makes a story have such broad appeal, I guess, is the question I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, I think the key is like with YA, what it really means is that your protagonist and your main characters are teenagers. So, and middle grade, it means they're basically like a slight generation younger. And so I think what makes a book have that crossover appeal and appeal as much to adults as to kids and young adults is that if you're not writing down to anybody, like I try to write my books, the way that I would want to read them, like, perfect for as perfect for adults as, well, perfect isn't the right word, but you know what I mean, as appropriate for adults as it is for teenagers. And I think it really comes down to like your protagonist and the experiences are all, mired in adolescence, but like the way you're writing, the themes you're talking about, can be so much bigger than that. And I think it's basically like, I think ultimately the answer is you're not writing down. And I don't even think writing down is necessarily a bad thing, depending on what you're trying to do. Like if you're working on early reader books or chapter books, like, for very young readers, obviously you're not going to try and push them with really intense plot lines to follow. So I think there's definitely a time and place for that too. But in the case of my books or some of the YA novels that you're mentioning, I think that's really the key, is that they're not writing any differently for kids or young adults than they are for adults. It's just the difference is, maybe there's a little bit, they're a little bit more careful with the content sometimes or language, in terms of like not cursing and stuff. But for the most part, you're just writing a great story that happens to have a teenage protagonist.
And writing down to a character in the sense of being mindful of things that they're ready for, is different from condescending.
Exactly. And I think for sure, I think when I say writing down, I sort of mean like you're trying to like match the language level of someone younger. And so I feel like that for sure is like appropriate when you're writing for like elementary school readers. Although some elementary school readers, actually, I have to say, are really advanced too. But I think there's definitely a place for the, trying to match the language of the really younger readers. But I think for YA, I think what's made YA so popular across a broad audience is the fact that, some of the storytelling and the prose that I find when I read YA books by my peers, it's just as, strong and rich and layered as adults.
Right. Alexandra, you come from a very interesting family, and you have a deep connection to the arts with your grandmother. Tell us about her, and what was the attitude of your family when it came to, were you encouraged to pursue the arts, and how important was this to the, in the home that you were raised in?
Yes, I feel so lucky that I was so encouraged and that I grew up in such a household that really just, loved the arts and books too. My grandmother, Monir Vakili, she was Iran's foremost opera singer. And she was just like this incredible icon in Iran at a time when the country was a little bit more westernized and there were more rights and opportunities for women than there are now. So it's a shame that things have, taken such a step back in terms of women's rights. But basically, she was just this incredible force in the country and force for women. And not only was she such a famous opera singer, but she also really helped the next generation of singers by opening the first co-ed, classical music school for singers. So an opportunity for young girls to study to become, like her. And so what's so tragic is that she died before I was born, just a few years before I was born. And so that's why I was given the name Monir as my middle name. And so I use it as my pen name because I like to kind of honor her legacy that way.
I love that. That's fantastic. You are also a singer and songwriter as well. I think a lot of people, when you start thinking about kind of having dual passions, especially when we're talking about art, that a lot of people think that they are mutually exclusive, But what I've found is that a lot of times they feed off of each other,
Yeah.
and the creativity, the act of creating something in one medium, a lot of time just really energizes the other instead of takes away from it. As being someone who with kind of a foot in each world, how do you feel about that?
I totally think that they feed off each other for sure. Like, um, often there's some sort of musical element in my books. With The Final Six and Life Below, it was really cool to imagine music as being one of the many kind of codes that are used when dealing with technology and aliens and stuff like that. But then I have other books where songs are actually a big part of it, and I write the music. So in my case, I have sort of like a really kind of symbiotic relationship between my books and music. And but yeah, I think it's just they're both telling a story. It's just one is over a much longer period of time than the other. And so for that reason, I think like books, I've just fallen in love with getting to live in the world longer. But songs can be such a perfect way of telling a story or expressing the emotion when you have to go bigger than words in terms of like the emotion of it.
Sure, sure. The new series is, very much near future sci-fi, and this kind of big adventure. The series that you wrote before this is a time travel series. Tell us about that series, that time travel series. How did you get into it, and what is it about time travel that intrigues you so?
So, Timeless was my first novel that I ever published. And so I'm forever just like have such a soft spot for that book. And it was really a circumstance where I'd always been fascinated by time travel. I mean, ever since I read that first Edward Eager book, The Time Garden. But then beyond that, anything that involved time travel, like the whole Hermione time turner plot in Prisoner of Azkaban is one of the reasons that's my favorite Harry Potter book. And so I've just always loved, Christmas Carol, anything that involves time travel, I'm instantly in. That's like when people say, what's your auto buy? Like if you hear about like a keyword or an author, that'll make you immediately click to buy it. Like for me, it's time travel. So I was thinking like, how I wanted to write something about time travel, but what would it be? And I remember I was standing in New York and it was winter and there weren't that many cars on the road. And I think like there was one of those like horse-drawn touristy carriages going by. And I was just in this like moment in time where it looked like I could have gone back in time. And, with these old amazing New York buildings and everything. And at the time I was going through a breakup. So I was having all these, angsty emotions. And I was thinking like, 100 years ago, another girl my age stood in the same spot in New York and felt the same way, and she got through it. And then I just thought, like, whoa, like that could be a story, like this idea of somebody going back in time, but actually meeting people that matter to her family, but 100 years in the past. And so from there, I immediately came up with the idea of this epic love story, and it definitely. Oh my gosh, that moment of inspiration yielded so much more than I ever could have imagined.
And that wound up being 3 books, is that right?
It was 2 books with
2 books.
like a novella in the middle.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and it wasn't even initially guaranteed to have a sequel, but because the first book, had such a great response from the get-go, that got the sequel greenlit. So, so there was a little bit of a gap between the 2 books as I was quickly like, figuring out, okay, time to write the sequel. So that's where the novella came in to kind of like bridge that gap.
Right, right. In writing that first series, the first 2 books and the novella, what do you think that you learned as a writer in beginning and finishing that? Other than as we say, putting your butt in the chair and getting things done. How did writing that initial series grow you as a writer?
Oh my gosh. Honestly, I learned how to write books writing that series because I know it sounds crazy, but that was the first book I'd ever written. And I got the deal based on a proposal, which it's definitely unusual. I think it was just the right idea at the right time because I pitched this idea when I think the first Twilight movie had come out maybe like 6 months before, something like that. So it was full Twilight, phenomenon. And so basically I came in with this idea Timeless that was also paranormal romance, but with its own time travel spin. And so I think the combination of that appeal plus the pages I turned in was enough to get a two-book deal, which is amazing. And the second book, initially, we just weren't sure what it was going to be, and that ended up becoming the sequel. But yeah, so I went from having this idea and this proposal to suddenly having to turn that into a whole book. And there were definitely some growing pains along the way, like what's so hilarious and embarrassing to think about now, but my first draft was only like 130 or something pages. And I remember calling my agent being like, so I wrote the whole book, but it feels short. And my very kind editor at Random House was like, this is kind of like you basically like wrote like an annotated outline, like a really detailed outline, but now you need to like flesh it all out and make it a full book. So that took a while. So Timeless is the longest I've ever spent writing a book. I think I got the deal. It was like October. It was October when I got the deal, and then it was like not the following October, but like I don't know, it was like a year and a half later that it was done. So because I was definitely learning on the job. But I think, it's interesting. I think there's like a little bit of a magic in that too, in that I was falling in love with learning how to write books at the time that I was writing it. And I had so much passion for the story. I had so much excitement. It definitely was not a job to me. And so I think maybe that has something to do, who knows, with why that book still resonates today, is that it was very natural. And of course, I look back on it now and I'm like, oh my God, I have chapter 1 open with a dream. Like, that's so cliche, like things like that. But then, that I obviously would do different now. But I think the overall story, it's interesting. It's still one of my, the one I still get the most reader feedback about, like of people really into it. So yeah, so sometimes not knowing everything or not being such an expert can be good.
Well, several things out of that I'm taking away from you don't have to be established, prior to writing the story that you want to write. And no one sells a novel, on a proposal except for when you do. And no one starts with a dream except for when you do. Yeah. And, sometimes it works. And, that sometimes the rules are there for general guidance, except for when you need to break them. Yeah.
And I totally agree with that. I mean, I think it's all about having a good story. Like, I didn't, go to any special school for writing. I didn't do anything really except just write. And then, of course, there's the networking involved of like, getting the right agent and getting in front of the right editors and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, as far as needing to come with like credibility of, a fancy school or degree behind you, or, credits or anything like that, like, you definitely don't need anything. It's really just the story. And honestly, so many of the most, successful writers today, I feel like they started out just like querying and, they started, from the very bottom too. So I think that's what's really nice about this industry is that anybody can make it.
Exactly. So from this original kind of dreamy time travel series to something a little more grounded, which is an odd thing to say about a space travel science fiction story. But this story definitely feels like it's grounded in real possibilities. Yes, it feels to me like, and please correct me because I know this is not going to be your story. But it feels to me like, someone is watching the news and kind of observing the world around us and then saying, I wonder what would happen? How are we going to get out of this mess? How are we going to solve these problems? And then, story just kind of erupts out of that. Where did the final six come from?
Yeah. I mean, that's totally, you hit it right on the head. That very inspired by current events. So I was listening to a radio interview and, basically this caller called in this was around the time of this Mars One experiment that was in the news. So that ended up seems like maybe it was a scam because nothing ever really happened with it. But basically, there was this private company that was planning to send a team of human volunteers to go and colonize Mars on like a one-way trip. And there was going to be a whole reality show and stuff like that. And so I was listening to a radio show, and this woman called in talking about it and how she was one of the finalists and how she had applied. And, even though she was married and she would be leaving behind a husband and friends and family, like she would totally do that in a heartbeat if she got chosen, just for the once in a millennium, or not even once in a millennium, once in a, in a universe chance at getting to go live on Mars. And I remember being so struck by that, thinking like, whoa, like she's brave. And also that's like so wild that you would leave your whole life behind. And then my thoughts took it to the next place of, what if it wasn't voluntary? What if it was actually a government mandated draft? And like, what if we were being drafted to space instead of to war? And so from there, the idea really just took off. I've never experienced anything like that, where like an idea just hits me like a lightning bolt, and immediately suddenly I'm like running to the computer and typing. And the relationship between Leo and Naomi came to me right away too. It was just this magical afternoon where I'm just so grateful that it happened.
Well, it almost has a sort of Hunger Games kind of feel, yeah, but for the betterment of humankind, yeah, instead of for someone's twisted enjoyment, right, which I love. But there's this common theme in a lot of stories that we tell about being kind of pressed into service, and yeah, young people forced to do things that they never would have volunteered for, maybe, yeah, not given a choice, and then having to rise to the occasion. Yeah. What is it about taking young people and putting them past what they think they can do?
I think it's that a lot of times especially when you're younger, you just don't know what you're capable of until you're thrust into those situations. And I think that's totally true for these characters. And I think that's true for most teenagers, unless you are, incredibly self-confident, which I think is something that people struggle with at all ages, but especially, confidence can get shaky in those years. You just really have no idea how much power and strength you have until you're called upon. So yeah.
The characters that came to you initially, Leo and Naomi. Mm-hmm. Naomi is American and Leo is Italian.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What is it about those nationalities that jumped out at you, or did they just come fully formed?
Yeah, well, so Naomi is actually, so she's Iranian American, just like me. And I think, it was important. Initially, I was just going to have her be just American. And then as I was writing, I started thinking like, God, I would have given anything growing up to see a character like me in this role, like this kick-ass heroine who's, the hero of this big epic space adventure. And you just never found like Middle Eastern characters in those roles ever, like in the fiction I was reading growing up. So I was just like, let me do it. And so that was so rewarding for me. And I feel like for that reason, she's my favorite character I've ever written. I think it'll be hard to ever beat her as far as writing another character I love as much. And she feels the closest to me, like her family feels like my family, just, it's just the closest character I've ever had to myself. And then with Leo, it's so funny. We were talking about Italy at the beginning of our conversation, and that's the country I love. I haven't been there in too long. I miss it. I love it. I love the culture and everything about it. What's interesting is that I didn't pick up on this until later, but my husband has an Italian last name. He's actually Colombian, but he was adopted by an Italian family in Jersey, my awesome in-laws. And so we have a super Italian last name. And and so it's funny. I think like I must have maybe a part of me was maybe thinking of my in-laws and my husband and his family maybe when I wrote the character of Leo.
Isn't it funny when when you get into a story and the story just seems to be coming from nowhere,
Yeah.
just out of the ether, and then later you look back and you say, well, of course that's where that came from. This is something that was so close to my heart. Of course it would bubble out like that.
Totally. And then I sort of brought it full circle by I had my first child like right around the time I was working on this book. And because I was pregnant with him, while I was doing like most of the heavy lifting with like revising and rewriting and stuff, I just felt like, oh my God, this boy's name has to be Leo. So yeah. So
Love it. You mentioned earlier when you were talking about your grandmother and talking about your grandmother's Iran, as opposed to our present day Iran. And in, by having Naomi, you get the opportunity to change perceptions a little bit of what it means to be Iranian and what it means to be Iranian American, to have those roots, to this ancient culture that, goes far past Iran, and a people with lots of story to tell. Was that important to you to kind of reclaim some of the narrative about that part of the world and the people that are from there?
Yeah, definitely. And I think what we see or hear in the news is very much like the current government in Iran as opposed to the people. Like the people are the best people. And, they're just so wonderful and kind and loving and, the actual people, the ones not in power currently. And it's true, like, the current government is very like, repressive when it comes to women and what they can do, but the actual people. And when my mom was growing up and my grandmother was very encouraging of women in science and arts. And so that is for sure what I was trying to show with the way Naomi's grandparents in Iran were encouraging her love of becoming a scientist herself.
When in the book, we've got a group of teenagers that are drafted and they're competing to be one of the six. And, as the title alludes to, the final six. What is their mission going to be? Where are they headed and what are they trying to do?
Yeah, so they are headed to Europa, Jupiter's moon, which has the 3 ingredients that are needed for life. And while they did try Mars earlier, pre the first book, that mission ended in a mysterious disaster, which comes back into play in the sequel, The Life Below. And so because Mars didn't work out, the United Nations and the International Space Stations, the International Space Agencies are pivoting to Europa, which has more potential for life and has an ocean even bigger than Earth's. And basically, the issues for Europa, the reason why Europa in the real world hasn't been considered as viable an option as Mars is because of the distance and the radiation. So I basically used my science hat and science fiction hat to kind of write a solution around that so that we could get to experience this untapped world that is so ripe for storytelling.
Right. It seems that going from a time travel series with kind of romantic overtones, and then writing something that is more truly science fiction and grounded, in the near future. And so we're looking at technologies that at least are possible, or at least, we can envision. You would think that those use 2 totally different sets of muscles, storytelling muscles. But at the end of the day, it's just storytelling. Because no matter the window dressing of the book and the all the genre stuff, if we don't have characters that we don't care about, then nobody cares. Could you talk a little bit about writing science fiction versus more of a fantastical type series?
Yeah, I think it's really the difference between magic and then having, grounded I mean, I tried to keep the magic systems as grounded as I could and timeless, but it was much more of a fantasy. I mean, she had a magical key that sent her back in time. It was a little bit more suspension of disbelief, and just, it was a little bit more of like, the closet Narnia, like you have this magical device. Whereas with the final six, these are all technologies that are either in play right now or being developed right now. So I think that's the biggest difference, is that with fantasy, you're truly like making it up, and there are no limits really. I mean, yes, there's a limit of how far you think your audience will buy into something, but basically you can go as big as you want. And then I think with sci-fi, it's just, you have to be a little bit more careful about, okay, does this seem like it's, it legitimately could work? Like, what's the science behind it, basically?
Right. What sort of preparation do you do for a book like this? And where do you kind of find the lines of, I can tell, I can create this amount of stuff, and the readers will go with me, but I don't need to put in, all of the technology that makes the shuttles work and all of that. And like, how do you balance, a fun adventure story without getting too overly hard science fiction?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I did so much research, and so I tried to be as knowledgeable as I could be, so that would just kind of come out on the page, hopefully. And then I think the way I sort of approached it was trying to basically describe things in, the average casual reader terms, as opposed to assuming that people understand what I mean by, the Kepler equation, or, things like that. So I did try to just explain things as straightforward as I could while keeping the action moving. I think, to me, the pace is so important in books like this, because you want it to have that adventure, thriller, edge of your seat pace. And so, explanations and things about the science should be quick, and I tried to do that.
Without giving away too much, the new book, the final six, book 2, is called The Life Below. That alludes to, that brings out all sorts of connotations. And we know that when we're dealing with a planet like Europa, the surface is very cold. And, what does the life below lead us into?
Yeah, well, basically, aliens, extraterrestrials. I think a lot of,
we love extraterrestrials.
Yeah. So a lot of people suspect that, I mean, even like the most credible scientists even suspect that there is some type of life under Europa's ice. However, the difference is, the really credible scientists say it's probably more like bacteria and microscopic or microorganisms, things like that. And so for this story, I basically just took that up, a bunch of notches. And I think that's a great way to actually also look at science fiction, is that you're always starting with something that's, unlike time travel with science fiction, you're starting with something that is very rooted in reality, and you're just like elevating that and heightening that. And so that's what I did. So do I believe that there's life below under the ice of Europa? I absolutely do. Do I think it's the way I described it? I feel like that would be really amazing and wild. But I think the reality might be more boring than that. But I tried to really let my imagination kind of fly in that part of the book. And I won't say too much because I don't want to give it away, but if you like alien stories that are rooted in science, I think you'll like this one.
Well, where do we find Leo and Naomi? Because that's the fun stuff that you're just telling us about. But we're following them on this adventure. Where do we find them, and what are the stakes for them?
Yeah. So in the final six, like the big kind of conflict between Naomi and Leo, and their sort of own personal conflicts as well, are that Naomi does not want to get chosen because she's so brilliant and well-versed in the science that she knows that there's more to this whole mission than they're being told. and she knows what the dangers are. She feels like it's, basically they're walking to their deaths here. So she does not want to go, especially because she is fortunate in that she has a family that's still living. A lot of the other contestants have lost people closest to them because of like the wave of natural disasters that have been happening due to climate change. So a lot of them are survivors themselves that are looking for a purpose to keep going. And that's Leo. Leo wants to be chosen. That's kind of all he has to look forward to is this opportunity of a lifetime to be a legend and go and save humanity. And for Naomi, she wants to stay home. So, I don't want to reveal a spoiler too much in case some of your listeners haven't read the first book yet, but definitely their plans get upended at the end of the first book. And, we find them separated at the beginning of the second one. So the second book is very much about how can and how do we bring these characters back together, while at the same time keeping the mission moving forward.
And get the audiobook of book one. I got a pre-release arc of The Life Below, but I grabbed the audio of the first book to get me up to speed. And man, the audiobooks are fantastic.
Oh, thank you. And I actually narrated Naomi's part on the audiobooks.
You sound familiar now. That's why.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it so much.
Thank you so much.
Alexandra, is this the end of the road for our favorite characters here? Do you have more planned for them?
So right now, basically, I try to end it in a way that it's like, a satisfying conclusion to me and hopefully to the readers too. But there are definitely still story threads that I would love to, at some point pick up. So I don't feel like the door is closed all the way. I think right now I've moved on to other things and other books that I have coming out later, but I could totally see myself revisiting this. So, that would be up to my publisher. So obviously the best way to make that happen is for people to really read and share the books. But yeah, I think there's definitely the possibility down the road.
How do you feel about the state of YA science fiction? Do you feel like that this audience is really primed for more stories like this? And do you think it's a good time to be writing science fiction for the YA audience?
Yeah, for sure. I think the YA audience has such an amazing appreciation for both sci-fi and fantasy. I feel like those genres do so well with this audience. And I think they just really have such a great love and appreciation for these like bigger, heightened stories.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Alexandra, this has been so much fun chatting. I love the books. The new book, The Life Below, is out. It was out yesterday, and it's out in Kindle edition, hardcover, and audiobook is coming up very soon, I believe. If folks are just learning about you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, is there a place they can connect with you online?
Yes, of course. I have my official website, alexandramonir.com. And then also I'm on Instagram at Alexandra Monir and Twitter at Timeless Alex. And then also, if you happen to be in New York or Las Vegas, this week I will be at those two Barnes & Noble locations on my book tour. So tomorrow, Thursday the 20th, I'm at Barnes & Noble Tribeca at 7 p.m. And then Saturday the 22nd, I'm at the Barnes & Noble Las Vegas on the Rainbow Promenade at 4 p.m. So if any of your listeners are in those areas, it would be so fun to get to meet you in person.
Absolutely. Alexandra, we will link up all of that great stuff in the show notes of this episode. There are links where you can buy the books, follow her book tour, and all of your social media. All of that great stuff will be in the show notes. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. The Life Below, out everywhere now. Go grab your copy.
Thank you so much. That was so great, and I loved your questions.
Stay tuned now for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War.
The near future. Humanity's only hope of survival entered the solar system at nearly the speed of light. The probe slowed as the sun's heliosphere disrupted the graviton wave it rode in on from the abyss of deep space. Awakened by the sudden deceleration, the probe absorbed the electromagnetic spectrum utilized by its target species and assessed the technological sophistication of the sole sentient species on Earth. The probe adjusted its course to take it into the system's primary. If the humans couldn't survive, with its help, what was to come, then the probe would annihilate itself. There would be no trace of it for the enemy, and no chance of humanity's existence beyond the time it had until the enemy arrived. The probe analyzed filed patents, military expenditures, birth rates, mathematical advancement, and space exploration. The first assessment fell within the margin of error of survival and extinction for humanity. The probe's programming allowed for limited, autonomous decision-making, choice being a rare luxury for the probe's class of artificial intelligence. The probe found itself in a position to choose between ending its mission in the sun's fire and a mathematically improbable defense of humanity, and the potential compromise of its much larger mission. Given the rare opportunity to make its own decision, the probe opted to dither. In the week it took to pass into Jupiter's orbit, the probe took in more data. It scoured the internet for factors to add to the assessment, but the assessment remained the same. Unlikely, but possible. By the time it shot past Mars, the probe still hadn't made a decision. As the time to adjust course for Earth or continue into the sun approached, the probe conducted a final scan of cloud storage servers for any new information, and found something interesting. While the new information made only a negligible impact on the assessment, the probe adjusted course to Earth. It hadn't traveled all this way for nothing. In the desert south of Phoenix, Arizona, it landed with no more fanfare than a slight thump and a few startled cows. Then it broke into the local cell network and made a call. Mark Ibarra awoke to his phone ringing at max volume, playing a pop ditty that he hated with vehemence. He rolled off the mattress that lay on the floor and crawled on his hands and knees to where his cell was recharging. His roommate, who paid the majority of their rent and got to sleep on an actual bed, grumbled and let off a slew of slurred insults. Mark reached his cell and slapped at it until the offending music ended. He blinked sleep from his eyes and tried to focus on the caller's name on the screen. The only people who'd call at this ungodly hour were his family in Basque country, or maybe Jessica in his applied robotics course wanted a late-night study break. The name on the screen was Answer Me. He closed an eye and reread the name. It was way too early, or too late, depending on one's point of view, for this nonsense. He turned the ringer off and went back to bed. Sleep was about to claim him when the phone rang again, just as loudly as last time, but now with a disco anthem. "Seriously?" his roommate slurred. Mark declined the call and powered the phone off. He flopped back on his bed and curled into his blanket. To hell with my first class, he thought. Arizona State University had a lax attendance policy, one which he'd abused for nights like this. The cell erupted with big band music. Mark took his head out from beneath the covers and looked at his phone like it was a thing possessed. The phone vibrated so hard that it practically danced a jig on the floor, and the screen flashed Answer Me over and over again as music blared. "Dude," said his roommate, now sitting up in his bed. Mark swiped the phone off the charging cord, and the music stopped. The caller's name undulated with a rainbow of colors, and an arrow appeared on the screen, pointing to the button he had to press to answer the call. When did I get this app? He thought. Mark sighed and left the bedroom, meandering into the hallway bathroom with the grace of a zombie. The battered mattress he slept on played hell with his back and left him stiff every morning. Dropping his boxers, he took a seat on the toilet and answered the call, determined to return this caller's civility with some interesting background noise. "What?" he murmured. "Mark Ibarra. I need to see you." The voice was mechanical, asexual in its monotone. "Do you have any friggin' idea what time it is? Wait, who the hell is this?" "You must come to me immediately. We must discuss the mathematical proof you have stored in document title This Can't Be Right, Doc. Mark shot to his feet. The boxers around his ankles tripped him up, and he stumbled out of the bathroom and fell against the wall. His elbow punched a hole in the drywall, and the cell clattered to the floor. He scooped the phone back up and struggled to breathe as a sudden asthma attack came over him. How? He couldn't finish his question until he found his inhaler in the kitchen, mere steps away in the tiny apartment. He took a deep breath from the inhaler and felt the tightness leave his lungs. That someone knew of his proof was impossible. He'd finished it earlier that night and had encrypted it several times before loading it into a cloud file that shouldn't have been linked to him in any way. "How do you know about that?" he asked. "You must come to me immediately. There is little time. Look at your screen," the robotic voice said. His screen changed to a map program, displaying a pin in an open field just off the highway, connecting Phoenix to the suburb of Maricopa. "Come. Now." Mark grabbed his keys. An hour later, his jeans ripped from scaling a barbed wire fence, Mark was surrounded by desert scrub. The blue of the morning rose behind him, where his beat-up Honda waited on the side of the highway. With his cell to his ear, Mark stopped and looked around before deciding how to continue. Spiked ocotillo plants looked a lot like benign mesquite trees in the darkness. A Native American casino in the distance served as his North Star, helping him keep his bearings. "You're not out here, are you? I'm being punked, aren't I?" he asked the mysterious caller. "You are 9.26 meters to my east-southeast. Punk, decayed wood, used as tinder. Are you on fire?" the caller said. Mark rolled his eyes. This wasn't the first time the caller had used the non-standard meanings of words during what passed as conversation between the two. Mark had tried to get the caller to explain how he knew about his theorem and why they had to meet in the middle of the desert. The caller had refused to say anything. He would only reiterate that Mark had to come quickly to see him, chiding him every time Mark deviated from the provided driving directions. "If you're so close, why can't I see you?" he asked. He took a few steps in what he thought was a northwesterly direction and squished into a cow patty.